a lot of opinions about a lot of subjects, and I blog about that and get whatever. So that's me. Because I've been looking to start something in the wireless space for the last 6 months or so, and actually gotten rather serious in the last 3 months, I've been looking at trends, say, back 10 years and estimating forward 10 years just to get a sense of what's happening. Strategy usually means what's going to happen in the next 2 to 4 years, but it helps to think about the trends that are longer so you don't get blindsided. So this includes a little bit of look back to the late 90s or 2000 and some comments on where we'll probably be in 10 years, but it's mostly trends for the next, say, 2 to 4 years. And the other thing is the material is a mixture of stuff for application developers, for service providers about business models, and an assortment of insights from other countries that might or might not be applicable here, because I did an awful lot of work with companies in Asia between 2002 and 2007, and I still have a lot of connections there. So this is looking back. This was the vision of what 3G was going to be. And in fact, this vision was put together in the 90s, and IMT 2000 was the ITU's heavily endorsed by the GSM Association and the mainstream cellular wireless community internationally, that by the year 2000, of course it was actually more like 2005, but by the year 2000 we were going to have single standard worldwide, universal access from everything from picocells to metropolitan and even satellite services, and it would all be uniform, managed on your behalf, and it would just seamlessly work. And with it there were going to be all sorts of carrier-provided applications, and the watchword literally up till about 2006 or 2007 was, we're going beyond voice, we're going to provide video and data over our admittedly voice-centric infrastructure. I think at this point there are still people in the cellular wireless community internationally who deeply believe that they're going to realize that 3G vision. But if you corner them privately and say, well, what do you think is going to happen in 10 or 20 years? They're willing to admit that, yeah, the internet is going to win eventually, and we just have to figure out how to make money on our current business model as long as we can. And that gets into a lot of interesting discussions, but if you find somebody in the service provider community that doesn't believe that, this is a very interesting graph from actually a Finnish grad student, Antero Kiva, who got, for his PhD thesis, he got access to detailed records, sort of packet by packet, of what was going on in 3 different Finnish 3G network operators. No confidential information, but aggregate information across everything. And in Finland, 3G rolled out late in 2006, and it wasn't used for voice. I mean, you could place voice telephone calls. If you count not the money being made, but the number of bytes that were passing over the network, we see this enormous thing in purple there in the middle. Within a period of less than 12 months, they went from virtually nothing to a zillion people using this 3G network, and independent of what they were paying for, what they were using it for, if you count the bytes, is they were using it for internet access for their laptop PCs. They got USB modem cards, plugged them in, and that's the 92% in purple there on the right. 92% of the bytes were to the open internet, completely independent of anything the operator was providing except a dumb pipe to the open internet, because they were PCs connected with USB modems. And the interesting thing is, if you take the other stuff, which is Nokia phones in blue down at the bottom, 4%, and all the other phones in green up at the top, 4%, take those 8% of phones, and they were smartphones that were generating traffic. 80% of the traffic was browsing the internet, 10% was email, and 10%, that's 10% of 8%, a fraction of 1%, in other words, were actually accessing carrier 3G services. So this has been repeated. This was public. His thesis was early in 2008, so it's about 15 months ago. But there's been repeated things from a lot of other places, and now there's emerging sets of market analyst studies that show that the predominant use in terms of traffic of all the 3G networks that anybody has any statistics for is to support USB modems. So this is an interesting thing. If you think about what is 3G for, and we need to answer that before we think about 4G, voice is still the largest revenue generator. Of course, that doesn't depend on 3G. It happens to run over 3G if you want to, but SMS is the second largest revenue generator by an enormous margin, which likewise runs over anything. In Asia, there are a number of things emerging. There's something called voice SMS, which is what you would think multimedia messaging would be, except it's typically implemented using SMS and voicemail. There's picture mail, which we have here. It's very expensive in the U.S. If you want to send a picture from your cell phone, it's liable to cost you 25 cents per picture or something, so most people offload their cell phone by other means. And then there's video mail, again, more likely to be social networking in Asia than here in the U.S., but that's just because mobile applications in Asia tend to be 4 to 5 years ahead of what we see here. Content. Awful lot of content delivery. We're beginning to see mobile TV. So far, the only significant adoption is in Japan and Korea. And we're seeing an enormous amount of mobile social networking that I have some information on. The interesting thing is, if you look at mobile content from an operator's point of view, the biggest money maker, not in the U.S., but in many countries in Asia, a few places in Southern Europe, Italy, Spain, India, South Africa. It's patchy, but it is ringback tones. And the reason is that ringback tones are a personalization service that really strikes a chord with young people. So countries that have a large youth population, like China, enormous adoption. The other interesting thing, though, about why the operators make money at this is it's nothing to do with 3G. Ringback tones is something that happens during the alerting interval. That is, I call you, and your phone sends music back to me that proves to me that you're really cool. That only works because the ringing signal is part of something embedded in the network. That's something that the operator has an absolute lock on. So the reason that all this content and all this money is being made is because it's a network service that can't be done over the top, over the internet. And of course, it also runs on any network that has a ringing signal. That's basically any telephone network since 1920. There is a lot of music being sold, and that's pretty much split between the operators delivering it because they have the application that's on the deck. That is, it's the application that comes up when you open the phone and request something. You get, in this case, Verizon VCast or Verizon applications, or it comes over the top, iTunes, what have you. Enormous amount of revenue there. That's not dependent on 3G per se, but it's facilitated by higher speed IP connectivity. Mobile TV, that's actually completely independent of 3G or 4G. It runs on different technology as a broadcast TV station, and it depends upon you getting a phone that has another radio receiver in it in addition to the cellular radio receivers. Basically, it's a broadcast service, completely independent of 3G or 4G. This is an interesting thing. If you look at mobile social networking, we think, when you say social networking, you think of Facebook and you think of the U.S. as being far ahead of everybody else. And that's certainly true in the internet space. But if you think about mobile social networking, in fact, Asia is so far ahead of anybody in Europe or the U.S. that it's hard to believe. very, very large number of mobile users in, at the left there, QQ.com. QQ is the largest instant messaging system in Asia, perhaps in the world, but it's almost entirely in China. Several 100 million people using it for instant messaging, 50 million using it for mobile social networking. Cyworld is in Korea, basically, nowhere else. I mean, a few other places, but basically it's a Korean social networking system. Mixi is the leading social networking system in Japan. And here's the interesting thing. These are figures for calendar year 2008. In Asia, they have these services. They've had them for a long time. They're very well adopted, and they're all profitable. Whereas Facebook is losing money on their mobile social networking by a big margin. But again, the interesting thing is this has nothing to do with 3G or 4G. That all runs on GPRS, on technology that was available in China in 2000 and 2001. So it's interesting to look at all these services that have been envisioned. These are the sorts of things, and I've certainly dealt with a lot of GSM association operators over, say, the last 6 years. Video telephony, I was supplying video telephony equipment to people since beginning in Japan in 2003. In just about any country in the world except the United States, if you have a GSM phone, you can get the video camera on it. You can place a video call to someone else who has a 3G GSM phone and actually see the other person's face. Not widely adopted, but it's a real service, and it's deployed in more than 40 countries, maybe more than 50 by now. Location-based services, that's been a key part of the 3G story from the very beginning, driven principally by regulation in the United States that required enhanced 911 service, that required the operators to provide location for emergency services, so they all put in the capability. Rich presence, push-to-talk, that is Nextel envy. Nextel always had very high average revenue per user. All the other operators wanted it, but it was dependent upon Nextel's very specific technology that was not compatible with anything else. Rich presence, which we know as instant messaging. The GSM Association, and then this is kind of typical of the operators, they refer to it as rich presence, which is the technology, whereas people who actually use it refer to it as instant messaging, which is the application. And that's indicative of a mindset difference between the wireless operator community and the real application developer community. Fixed mobile convergence, people have been talking about that for a number of years. Some of it sort of works. IP multimedia services, IMS, a lot of different services envisioned there. At the moment, push-to-talk is sometimes used with a variation of IMS. Video sharing has been launched in the United States by AT&T Wireless using IMS. And, of course, there's converged all IP. The operators really want to get all of their legacy voice and SMS and all that other stuff to run on one common network without having to differentiate. And they know that should be an all-IP network. They talk about it. When I was an equipment supplier, we promoted whatever. We sold stuff to them on that basis. But the reality is, if you look at all these applications, those are applications that have had some limited adoption. But as formerly an equipment vendor into the 3G 324M video telephony market, I will tell you that we got design wins, we got the initial install, but adoption never happened, so we never got the follow-on business. And we did that in country after country, beginning in Japan in 2003. And so it was a good business, but where we thought we were going to make hundreds of millions of dollars, it never grew to more than a $10 million a year business, just because there was never follow-on, because it was never adopted. It was tried and get a small percentage of the people using it. Push-to-talk, That's getting better. The Nextel envy is still there. AT&T and Verizon would love to have viable push-to-talk services that would compete with Nextel. They're getting there, but it requires a lot less latency, so they've had problems matching the Nextel performance. That will happen eventually. Fixed mobile convergence, the video sharing application in the case of AT&T Wireless, it only works on 5 specific telephone sets, and only if you sign up for it as an extra cost special option. The result is there is nobody to share video with, so nobody is using it, so they've lost on the network effects. But those are the good points. If you look at location-based services, they've been completely bypassed. The operators have no participation in it. Google and everyone else does it on their own. The rich presence, which is the GSM Association's really big push, basically the mobile instant messaging systems that work are the ones that are based on third-party instant messaging that already have an installed base and putting a mobile client. So there's business there for people who are selling client software to the operators, but not to run a operator-specific instant messaging service, but rather to give you access to whatever is the instant messaging service that you currently use. The all-IP network, that's a vision that I was selling into for many years, but it's still waiting to actually happen. So it's worth looking at the location-based services to think about what went wrong. This is something that literally came out of a regulatory requirement in the United States and ended up being forced on the operators and thus forced on the equipment suppliers. And then the operators said, well, gee, we could make money at this. And in the end, the European regulators followed the U.S. regulators, and the equipment manufacturers built it. It took about a decade to get built into the standards, but by and large, even a small African country that's buying equipment today, the equipment has, if it's not, it may or may not be enabled, but it has the ability to locate handsets with some degree of accuracy, probably better than Google can do with their non-carrier supported system. It has been completely implemented. It took many, many delays versus the U.S. regulatory requirements and waivers and so forth, but it works today. But the operators never figured a business model to make it attractive for third parties to use. A lot had to do with worries about privacy and getting sued by customers and so forth. But the result is none of the operators make no money from location-based services. It's an expense because they have to supply these things to 911 emergency answering points. But it doesn't generate revenue. Instead, if you look at any of the location-based services that you find on phones, they work by either the phone has GPS in it, or they get the cell ID from a database that's been put together by third parties. Google has such a database, Navizone has such a database, Skyhook has such a database. Or if it's a dual mode cellular and Wi-Fi, both Navizone and Skyhook, and probably Google, are busy accumulating a database of every Wi-Fi access point that publishes an SSID. So even if it's a secure encrypted Wi-Fi base station, if they can determine the geographic location of it, your phone can see that SSID, and then you know where that phone is to within 100 feet or so. Very interesting. That's something pioneered by Navizone and now done by a bunch of companies. They incent individual subscribers who have GPS and Wi-Fi to load a program that uploads data to Navizone or Skyhook, and as people with those phones walk around, they get GPS coordinates for different SSIDs, and they upload them. You can go to, say, the Navizone website and register there for free and search. I looked about 3 months ago at the route from my house to my work, about 5.5 miles, and they'd obviously had other people who'd driven that route because they had every house, like, bing, 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 where all the SSIDs were, and which ones were secure and which ones weren't, for hundreds and hundreds of SSIDs, and they know exactly where those those radio signals are coming from, so they can locate you. So all that is done independent of the mobile operators. We'll come back to what the operators might be able to do that would actually make money on things like that. Billing services. This is a natural, and not only is it a natural, but there's actually a proof point. The Japanese operator Docomo in 1999 introduced a service called iMode, which provided basically an open platform for developers who wanted to develop data applications in Japan, and what they provided was a optional billing service. So if you wanted to have the operator bill for your application, bill on your behalf, the Docomo had a billing system that they took only 9% commission, which is a lot more than MasterCard, but is vastly less than Verizon or AT&T does for, say, music downloads, where they're looking at 40 or 50%. Open platform with a billing service. The result is business soared, and people have been talking about this. I have heard keynote addresses at GSM Association annual meetings. It's not like the operators aren't aware of this enormous success, but no operator has duplicated it anywhere in the world that I'm aware of. Typically, the only way you can get operator billing to work on your behalf is to leverage their existing premium rate number service, which is something that comes out of the 900 number. As it's done in the mobile world, there are premium rate numbers and there are SMS short codes, premium rate codes for SMS messages. So the result is, if you want to do an application and get paid for it, you have to go to a third-party billing arrangement, or you have to come up with a complicated user interface that sends some premium rate SMS messages back and forth, so you can use this SMS billing arrangement because it's the only thing the operators anywhere in the world except Japan support. So mobile broadband access. The question is, if 20 years from now everybody will concede that it's just going to be the internet, and how do I get connected to the internet? The question is, how much can you get connected to the internet today, and how soon is that likely to change? So the big thing that has upset the world of mobile operators in the past 24 months is the iPhone. The iPhone launched in June of 2007. Basically, traffic has soared. If you look at Google searches from mobile phone traffic is still a tiny percentage of anything, but amongst the mobile phone traffic, more than half of the searches come from iPhones. So the iPhone is not only something that's actually usable, but Apple managed to cut a deal with AT&T that gives us a glimmer of what might be possible. Now, it's interesting that Apple is hardly an open platform. In fact, it's the only reason we think of this iPhone thing as open is by comparison with the mobile operators, who were so locked up tight. The reality is that the Apple platform is tightly controlled by Apple. You can't, as Google Voice found out recently, you can't launch a service which would compete with Apple or change the way the iPhone's user interface works for voice functionality or SMS messaging. You can't run VoIP over 3G because of the arrangements with AT&T, and there are other rules that people are trying to guess by reverse engineering what has been approved and what hasn't been, because obviously Apple's approvals have to do with Apple's business interests and Apple's contract with AT&T that isn't published and no one knows what the rules are. So this is not an open internet environment in the sense we would consider the internet. If you got an internet connection in your home from somebody who had to approve any application you were going to be, you wouldn't consider that the open internet. You'd consider that some kind of funny service. But they do have a $30 a month flat rate data plan. That's $30 on top of a voice and SMS plan that goes from $40 up. Typically, iPhone users are paying more than $100 a month, but The point is, it is flat rate for unlimited usage, and that's something that most people are interested in. People have a psychological aversion to not knowing what the bill is going to be, so people will gladly sign up for a bundle of things at a known price, even if it causes them to pay a lot more than they would if they paid on a per message basis. It's the idea of knowing in advance that, well, I've committed $40 a month. It's going to be $40 a month. It's not going to be $22 one month and $63 the next. So, flat rate data plan, and the fact of the matter is they got the accelerometer user interface from the Wii. They got the two-finger touch thing from a number of demo systems that have shown up, but none of which have been commercialized before they did it. And they produced something which is the best web browser on a mobile device at this particular point in time. But it's not the internet. This is the internet. You can go and buy a USB modem that plugs into the side of your PC. They're available in a lot of places. You can't get a flat rate connection to the internet in the sense you can at home. They all come with caps. You also don't get an open. There's a lot of caveats in the terms and conditions. They tell you can't run servers, you can't do P2P, you can't use this for a substitution for private line or frame relay circuits. You can't. It's a block of fine print text that takes a third of a page. They don't. They originally said you couldn't use VoIP services. They don't say that today, although they empirically block VoIP services as best they can. However, if you get one of these, none of them publicly say that they block VoIP, and you can run Skype from your laptop connected to one of these USB modems. Interesting when you go and look. I looked about a month ago when I last looked. The premium, the most premium plan you can get from AT&T Wireless has a 5 gigabyte cap per month, costs $59.99 a month. Go to Verizon, go to Sprint, it's exactly the same. The only difference is whether it's $59.99 or $59.95. The other minor difference is in the way the extra charges are allotted, because this is the list price. The street price is actually more like $72 a month when you add all the other fees. So unlike where you'd expect the street price to be less, here the street price is actually more. There's no U.S. operator that offers flat rate unlimited plans. There's no open internet the way we consider it at home. And the reason for that is that there are only 3G operators. Now it's interesting, if you remember in the, say, 96 to 2004 in the U.S., we were building out the cellular voice infrastructure. It started back in the 80s, but it took off in 96 when we went from 2 operators to 7 or 8 in every city. And during the period when we had 8 or more operators offering mobile voice services, we had incredible growth ramp, incredible competition, all sorts of deals. You can look around the world, and country by country, there are over 200 countries now that have mobile voice telephony services of one sort or another. And there's a complete correlation between the number of viable competitive operators and the growth rate of mobile phone adoption. This is just pure voice telephony, not broadband applications or broadband internet. But the correlation is the more operators you get, and 4 seems to be a breaking point. When you get 4 or more operators, you break the oligopoly, the same everything, and you get into a period of rampant competition. So on an optimistic note, while we have 3 established 3G operators in the U.S., we've had a massive amount of consolidation in voice services, and we only have 3 3G data networks that are viable today. That's about to change. T-Mobile USA, who's always been sort of the 4th weak sister in terms of coverage, but their parent company, which is Deutsche Telekom in Germany, has mobile networks in a lot of countries. It's a major, well-financed international company, and they appear to be investing in the U.S. market. They spent $4.2 billion on purchasing spectrum in auctions in the latter part of 2006. At that time, they publicly committed that they were going to spend another 2.7 on the initial rollout. It's gone far beyond that. They are now spending approximately $1 billion per quarter. As of late 2008, they had about a third of their existing network covered. I don't know that their plan at one time seemed to be that they would have their entire network covered by the end of 2010. I don't have a firm press release from them saying what the commitment is, but it's pretty clearly happening. The second thing is Clearwire. Clearwire is a venture controlled by Craig McCaw, who is a wireless entrepreneur who has made a potload of money in several earlier ventures. He has now got control of the Sprint WiMAX spectrum. He's building a WiMAX network under the Clearwire brand, using both spectrum that he accumulated with Clearwire and spectrum that Sprint owned, that they were originally going to run their Zoom service on. So he, as far as I understand, he has financing capital for this build-out that will cover him through the summer of 2011, and he doesn't know how he's going to go beyond that. That's my guess. However, based on it being Craig McCaw, my feeling is he will find additional financing. So that is a fifth network, which means we have a potential for significantly more affordable flat-rate mobile broadband services of some sort, beginning probably in 2010 and certainly by 2011. So there is reason for optimism. So let's just talk about subscribers and applications for a moment. Historically, that is prior to the iPhone, basically the applications you used were the ones that came pre-installed on your phone. Very few people, like 1 or 2%, would actually download an application. And frequently, say you download a Java application to your Java-enabled feature phone, and it runs, but you don't know where it is. It's buried down 3 layers in a menu, and you can't even find it the next morning. Or if you can find it, there's a real aggravation of using it because it takes 4 or 5 clicks before you can get to it to turn it on so you can access its user interface. So the reality is, prior to the iPhone, basically you got what was on the phone, and that was what the vast majority of people used. With the advent of the iPhone, everything has changed. I think they're past 50,000 applications. They went past 1 billion downloads sometime this spring. I think it might be approaching 1.5 billion downloads. Everybody is paying attention to this, including the mobile operators. I can't see any way that the mobile operators would have allowed something like this to happen, but Apple cut a deal with AT&T. It's now obvious to mobile operators that this is a revenue-generating approach. So they're all looking at things, and they're willing to talk to all the other players, which include Google Android and RIM and Palm and Qualcomm and Microsoft, Handango, Adobe, you name it. Now, will they all succeed? Obviously not. Probably 2 or 3 of them will, end up with big market share. But it's pretty clear that where people literally talk about in order to succeed, you had to get your application on the operator's deck. And that was just the mantra up until literally a year ago. Now everybody says, if you're in the iPhone thing, you want to be in the iPhone store, and there's a whole bunch of issues there that there's so many things you can't tell what's there, and there's 20 people who are making money and 5,000 people who are not. But the reality is the place where you have to fight the battles is completely shifted, and it's no longer in the operator's control. It's moved off. The deck is now the application store. So if you're developing applications, the iPhone is a clear thing, but the iPhone is a very small part of the world market, even though it is so spectacular. It represents perhaps 40 million phones, in a world that has 3 to 3.5 billion phones. So it's a negligible drop in the bucket of the world market for phones. But the moment you go beyond it, there's all sorts of interoperability issues. This is basically everything is different. It's not like PCs where Microsoft controls things. You know what the environment looks like. It's not like the Internet, that is the fixed Internet, where there are a bunch of different browsers. There's the Internet Explorer, there's Mozilla Firefox, there's Google Chrome, there's Apple Safari. But amazingly enough, the overlap in what they do is common enough that most websites work either perfectly or nearly perfectly in everything. The only exception is some corporate websites that use funny Microsoft stuff and only work for Microsoft browsers. But increasingly that's not acceptable if you're trying to sell to the public. So the reality is that we've got enormous uniformity. We don't have that in the wireless world, and I'm afraid I can't tell you that we're going to get there in the next 5 years. This is a picture from 30 months ago from an Indian company that we acquired for a set of technology when we were selling IP multimedia system applications to some operators in India. The interesting thing was the IP multimedia system, the grand set of standards, which are still not widely deployed, was supposed to make everything simple, but in fact what we found was that like any other so-called standard, but even worse in the case of mobile operator and large equipment providers, Ericsson, Huawei, Lucent, Alcatel, which were separate companies at that time, Siemens, Motorola, they each implemented the specs in different fashions. So in fact, just using the same spec was a difficulty. Now that's a system that never really got widely deployed. If you look at handsets in the world today, the reason that we're not going to see the kind of convergence that we saw with PCs, at least in the next couple of years, is a fundamental limit down in the hardware. When Moore's law gets to the point that you've got more processing capacity than the programmers know what to do with, and that's been the position in the PC world. I mean, Microsoft has to struggle to come out with the next level of bloatware to slow down these processors. They're getting very, very fast. But in the mobile handset or mobile device world, you have this battery problem, and that affects everything. So you've got weight and you've got battery life. And so Moore's law has not, it's absolutely helped, but there's not a vast amount of extra technology headroom that means that you don't have to optimize everything else. You have to optimize software to get a handset that will have good battery life. You have to optimize applications. Your application can't be polling all the time because the battery is going to be dead in a matter of minutes. If you turn on the radio to poll somebody every 5 minutes, your battery life is, even when you're in idle, is going to be terrible. So there's a fundamental reason why we have diversity and why we will have diversity in this area for the next 5 or 10 years. And we have to figure out what's the minimum of that diversity that we can work around. There are obvious hardware. It's not one chip vendor, not Intel. There are 4 or 5 or 6 chips that have large installed base. Screen size, very notable difference. I was involved in a lot of video content delivery to handsets last year. If you want to deliver video content to North American handsets, MobiTV does that over IP to handsets. MobiTV needs to produce 11 different versions of every kind of content that comes in. So they're taking an input feed and they're pre-coding it into 11 different versions to cover about 235 different kinds of handsets. Their objective is to expand that to 18 different versions so they can get better performance on some of the handsets that they're only approximately matching right now. So screen size, big issue. Processing capacity of what codecs are actually in the handset, major issue. Operating systems, all over the ballpark. Nokia sells so many phones in the world that they have their Symbian is a market leader, but no uniformity there. Above the operating system, and this gets more and more interesting now because I wouldn't suggest that you write code for chips or for the operating system, but if you look at runtime environments, now that's a level to which you probably will be writing code, not in the first pass, but when you're trying to optimize things. And there are many different runtime environments in the world today. I'll have some comments on where we might settle out. And then above that, there's the web environment, that is the browser. The good news here, and I have some graphs a little bit later, is that we're moving towards common browser environments that partly because WebKit, which is an open source rendering engine and core of a browser. WebKit is now used by Apple in Safari and in the iPhone. It's used by Nokia. It's used by Android. Basically it's become the dominant core. Now it's customized by all these guys in different fashions, but the core is the same. So that's what the picture looked like back in February when I did this. Bunch of data from Andrea Constantino. Vision Mobile Research is a great. He's a smart guy with a bunch of other people doing things on the mobile application space, and he put together a version somewhat different, different axes, but I cobbled his idea and a lot of his data set and moved it around with his permission. Core applications and downloadable applications. Second parties means that it's developers selling to the people who build the handsets. Third party means it's developers selling to consumers. I put Android down in the lower right because it's doing both. In fact, Android shows up because it's a stack all the way from the operating system up to the web browser, and it's being sold to consumers, and it's being sold to developers basically, and it's being sold to handset vendors. So you can argue where that should show up. So I said earlier that the internet was clearly going to win in the end, even if the end was 10 or 20 years in the future. But over the next 5 years, this is the thing about the internet that we have to bear in mind. The open internet rendered on your PC with 1024 by 768 screen, which is what that is. There's Facebook, my Facebook page in the background, and then in the middle is Philip Hubb's mobile Facebook page, not the same page, but similarly, you notice the layout is completely different. And the reason is the mobile Facebook website is different. When you go to Facebook, they notice that you're coming from a mobile web browser and immediately divert you to something that takes into account the fact that you have a small screen. And as I mentioned earlier, that's going to be an issue for many years to come. Moore's Law is not going to overtake PCs just because Moore's Law may apply to silicon, but it doesn't apply to batteries. So the reality is, certainly for the next 5 to 10 years, and I can't project anything beyond that, the internet is going to win eventually, even in the mobile space, but the internet's going to show up in different forms, and that's significant because if you are running a corporate website today, it probably only works on PCs. Very few corporate websites proportionately recognize the fact that there's an increasing number of mobile browsers. So if you sit there with your iPhone, you have to use the two-finger pinch and whatever to expand the thing and to move it around and so forth, slurp back and forth, because the website was designed for a PC with a big screen. The fact that Facebook did this and dozens of other applications are now figuring out that they want to talk to mobile is important, but across corporate America or corporate global companies, web enabling is happening in Asia. It's going to have to happen in the US. Your corporate website will have to have the ability to recognize what the browser is and render an appropriate thing when it notices that it's a mobile browser. Change the format. Same material laid out in a fashion that works with the much, much smaller screen. So there's a set of interesting trends here. First off, the application store. It's much easier distribution, easier discovery on the part of users. It's clearly, even the mobile operators have conceded that that's the way the world is going to go. We are seeing more and more smartphones. In the U.S. and Europe, smartphone adoption is going up at a very fast rate. And that means we're getting very rich browser capabilities. iPhone has shown everybody in the smartphone business what's possible, and everybody is scrambling to duplicate that, from the Taiwanese original equipment, original design manufacturers who actually design a lot of things on contract basis for U.S. and European houses. The other piece is, which we'll talk about in a moment, is getting beyond the device, just the browser to reach in and access device capabilities. And then you have to talk about the middleware environment, and it varies from phone to phone. If you want to access the phone book or the contact log and bundle that into your web-based application, deal with incoming events, or other core functionality of the phone, that remains a complicated thing. So if you were doing an application for mobile, do the web first, and then think which phones have in my target demographic of users, what phones are they using, and are there specific phones for which I can improve the behavior of my web-based application by doing something that is telephone specific, an app like an app for the iPhone. If you look at the stages of what happens here, we passed through phase one over the last decade, that is the pre-web, WAP, iMode in Japan. Today, the full web is accessible, but you need something like the iPhone, which can slither back and forth because it's not designed for the mobile phone. It's designed for large screen resolution PC. The phase that's just beginning to happen now is phase 3. That is, people are designing things for the web experience, which means that you're optimizing the web experience. You're thinking about speed-ups that will minimize the amount of stuff that has to download before something is displayed. You're thinking about screen size. You're building a mobile variant of your corporate web page, if you will. Next beyond that is application developers doing mobile-specific apps are looking to environments like Java ME or whatever is on a significant percentage of the phones that their customers or target demographic are using, so they can integrate that as extensions that improve the behavior for people who have specific kinds of phones. Going a long distance, into the future, we need to be thinking about all sorts of other issues. Today, applications have problems with persistence because you can't poll regularly or you destroy battery life. So there's a whole set of issues about working around battery life and yet getting application appears to be persistent and aware of what's happening, even though it doesn't poll the central server every 5 minutes. Successful mobile experience. There are a lot of things, and you can get the slide deck afterwards, but I particularly love this thing that Paul Golding did, at least 80% of which I directly agree with, in terms of thinking through your mobile application and what is actually going to cause it to succeed. And you really have to think about discovery. How is the user going to find out the thing exists? That's where the application stores are so far ahead of any other mechanism that existed for third-party developers. What happens when somebody installs the thing, takes it out of the box, if you will, downloads it, installs it, how does it behave? Does it require setup and customization, or does it do something immediately? What's the whole series of things here in terms of what kind of passion can you induce in your users? How does it connect them with other people? Great set of thoughts to keep in mind if you're actually doing something. But Summary of the challenges, the handset diversity we've talked about, the pace of change. The world looks completely different today than it did 24 months ago because of the iPhone. It's going to look completely different in the next 24 months because of a dozen people who are responding to the iPhone, certainly including Google Android, but you can't discount Nokia. Nokia is the world's largest cell phone manufacturer. They may not be dominant in the U.S., but they are in most of the rest of the world. The pace of change in the next 2 years is liable to be as fast or faster and more turbulent than what we've seen in the last 2 years. User interface, how do you minimize the number of clicks that somebody has to do and maximize the speed or the responsiveness of what you're doing? We mentioned battery life. Application concurrency, there's a whole issue there that comes down to managing events. In a lot of these environments, you can run a web application, but if you want to integrate it with things on the phone, you don't have a common way of managing events coming from core applications in the phone with things at different levels. It's an unsolved problem in most of the application development environments. And I mentioned the persistent user experience across time, but also across multiple applications. So what do you do about this handset diversity? Today, the answer is you build a web-based application first, and then you look in your target demographic, and if you're a corporate web thing, then you're looking amongst your employees or maybe amongst your customer set. But you look amongst whatever you think is the target demographic for the application you're doing, and you try and figure out which environments do I do in what order, and that's based strictly on how many people are going to benefit. And I've talked to a number of different developers in the last 18 months, and increasingly people are willing to talk about customization beyond a pure web app for 3 environments. They're not, whether it's a big company or a small company, they're not going to invest in 10 or 12 environments. And that's very telling because that suggests that we know what the outcome is going to be 5 years from now. There are only going to be 3 environments. And one of them will presumably be the iPhone, one of them will probably be Android, and one of them will probably be Nokia. Now, is that true? I don't know. I mean, BlackBerry has a very, very high thing. So maybe there's 5 environments left, but only 3 in any given demographic. Because the reality is most of the developers I've talked to say that they do a web app first, and then they customize or enhance that application for the 3 most popular environments based on the demographic. By the way, in the lower left there is mobile browser market share. If you take WebKit, because it's the iPhone and the Nokia Symbian S60 and the Google Android, and it's a pile of different, both existing and future mobile browsers are using WebKit. WebKit comes in number 1, Opera comes in number 2, and all the rest don't much matter. If you take smartphone operating systems, again, the Symbian OS, which is from Nokia, is about half because Symbian is the dominant phone supplier in the world. iPhone, that's just smartphone, and smartphone is still a very small percentage of the total market. It's worth remembering that everybody talks about the iPhone. It's a fraction of the smartphone market. Everybody talks about smartphones, and there are a bunch of them, and Moore's Law suggests it will only get better and better. However, in the U.S., smartphones are 15% of the phones. In India, they're single-digit percentage, and in Nigeria, they're less than 1%. Most of the phones in the world, most of the phones in the U.S. are feature phones. They got embedded real-time operating systems whose names you've never heard of, and they have, interestingly enough, they do have a web browser, and they have an application environment increasingly because Moore's Law is catching up even with the cheap low-end things. So they may have Java, they may have Flash, Qt, but they have they have a web browser and an application environment. So again, depending on your user demographic, that could be an interesting piece of things. So today you've got a phone, you've got a browser, you've got a camera, you've got a media player. It's pretty clear that the enabling environments, that is the mixture of the web browser and the application environment that operates right below the on the phone, whether that's Java or Qt or one of the Adobe solution. There are a bunch of people going at that level also. The point is that the competition is to produce an environment that will extend a web-based application to take advantage of core cell phone capability and do that in a fashion that becomes dominant. I'll give you, three environments likely to survive. Obviously, Java is one of them because it has a large installed base today. I can't tell you which ones will be there 5 years from now, but I'll suggest that there'll probably only be 3 players. Biggest takeaway here, which, if I'm talking to mobile operators, is they're beginning to concede it now. They're not giving up the revenues or whatever, but if you talk to them one-on-one privately, they admit that the iPhone has changed the lay of the land, and their issues for the next 2 or 3 years are to cut deals with either Apple or with one of the other application stores that they think, either Android or Nokia or something, and get the most revenue they can out of whatever deals they cut. But the application has passed to the initiative has passed to mobile operator from mobile operators to application developers. So just nobody. I don't think this. Somebody may have walked in. Is there anybody here who works for a service provider? Oh, Verizon Wireless. Okay. So, is there any hope, or are you just going to be a dumb pipe 10 years from now? A lot of things out there. Advertising isn't going to cover it. If you look at the revenues from voice and SMS, which the current operators make globally, big chunk of money, and you compare that to the entire global advertising in the entire world across television and movies and print and everything, it just doesn't do it. So even if all advertising in the world ended up happening over mobile phones, it wouldn't pay the sort of money that we pay for voice telephony today. The best candidate that's out there right now, and this is based on a couple of real things that I'll point at, but it's referred to in economics as two-sided markets. If you think about eBay, they're not selling something to a person. They are connecting buyers and sellers. They have one side and the other, and they're taking a commission on something like that. And there's actually a couple of examples in the telephone industry where that's already working. If you look at nightclubs, very frequently women get in free because the idea is to incent more people to show up and buy drinks, and you'll get more men to come and buy drinks if there are women there. That's the way it works. Media, newspapers, you give away the newspapers or you sell them for the cost of delivery because you make money on advertising. Well, of course you don't anymore now that Craigslist is there, but that used to be the way newspapers worked. Broadcast TV, historically it was free. That's changing also, but you attracted as many people on one side, and then you monetized the existence of all those people by getting advertising dollars. Akamai is a content delivery company, and they actually put servers in ISP's facilities where the ISP gives them space and gives them power and air conditioning. And what they do is they save the ISP a certain amount of their upstream expense for internet transit, and more particularly, so it's an incentive, a one-for-one value for the ISP, and then they go and they monetize, and their real money comes from selling services to content providers who want rapid delivery because the content is close to the users. So how does this work in the telephone industry? It's already been working for 30 or 40 years in something which we know in the U.S. as 800 numbers, free phone service, as it's called in other parts of the world. Basically, you sell a service to businesses. You're monetizing the hundreds of millions of telephone users who are your customers. You're giving your telephone users a free service, and you're monetizing it by selling something on the other side to businesses. That's a two-sided business. You're taking things on one side and getting value from people on the other side. Not quite as good as eBay, where they take a commission in both directions, but very, very similar. Billing services. I mentioned Docomo earlier. Docomo is the one example in the world of a extremely successful monetizing their billing service. In 1999, they provided their iMode service. It was on a 2G data platform that had 9.6K bits per second, tiny screen, but they gave away software development kits. They made the platform completely open to the limits of Japanese law for pornography, but other than that, completely open. And they offered an optional bill on behalf of billing system for which they charged a 9% commission. Now, if you think about Verizon Wireless, they sell content and they want a 40% commission. Docomo offered billing for any application developer, 9% commission. That's twice what MasterCard gets in its worst thing and 3 times what MasterCard gets in their beneficial things. But it's so much better than every other mobile operator in the rest of the world that this service actually succeeded. In the first 24 months, they got more applications than iPhone got in their first 24 months by a little bit. They also got 30 million subscribers. iPhone is at 40 million now. But very, very, this was in just Japan. So this was an incredible success. And the interesting thing is, there is from 1999 to 2000, the first 24 months just went from nothing, because they got a zillion applications out there. If you look at what happened, it was open to anybody. It was a 9% commission. They got 100,000 new applications in 3 years, and of that 100,000, 15,000 of them, only 15%, signed up for the billing service. But the result was, given revenue from subscribers signing up for data plans and revenues from those businesses for which they were getting 9% as a commission, Docomo ended up with the highest data service revenue of any operator in the world, and they maintained that position. I don't have data since 2000, for at least 9 years. I think for 10, and we'll have to see where things are this year. They may finally get an upset, whatever. But this is revenue just from people in Japan, and a decade of whatever. There's no other mobile operator in the world that has managed to figure this out. There were some people in Europe who tried to copy iMode, but they were charging a 35% or a 30% premium for billing, and it never took off. So that's a two-sided market. It's obvious. Operators don't seem to have thought it out. What's the operator have that they could do to pay for their dumb pipe? They have a brand, obviously, and they have PSTN numbers, which is what the 800 number was selling, among other things. They have location, which I mentioned earlier they had failed to monetize, but it's there. Very fine-grained billing system, which can be used to bill on behalf of people. All sorts of user data, name, address, age, devices. There are obvious privacy issues, but on the internet, people manage privacy issues and manage, Facebook, Google, all those people. Mobile operators have and they have rich presence, but they don't make it directly available to people. And certainly the GSM Association is trying to run their own instant messaging systems, not make this available to, especially with something like an iPhone or something that has an accelerometer, I ought to get a different behavior if I put the phone down face down versus if I put it down this way. One means I'm in a meeting, and the other, it knows where I am. A rich presence compared to instant messenger on a PC, and a bunch of customer relationships. So this is the opportunity. Right now, the telcos are doing a retail business down there, that line on the bottom, which connects them to millions of customers. Hopefully, they'll figure this out, because it is clear the internet is going to win. We've got a decade of interesting battle ahead, but there's tons of customers on the left who would pay money if there were services that made it possible for them to access the operator's core assets and use them. we'll see how it plays out. So I would say rich mobile applications are coming. They're going to be internet-based. It makes an enormous number of opportunities, but the next 5 years, and certainly the next 10 years, are going to have dramatically different business models. And the iPhone, while it may appear to be an open environment, is incredibly closed compared with what is actually going to succeed. So there's room to trump Apple if somebody were to wake up and do it. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thanks, Brough.
And
by the way, I'm Paul Kusman here with the 4GW, and we still have a couple minutes if people have some questions. We don't have any microphones today, so just speak up if you have some questions. I have one actually to start off with, Brough, which is, given that eBay sold its Skype division off today, it seems like there's a lot more interest in mobile telephony or internet-based telephony in general. What is going to happen? The Apple, the App Store, the iPhone, everything came out. What might other providers do? Do you see a Verizon or an AT&T trying to snap up application developers, or are they going to?
Well, the Skype is a particular case because it is a voice application, and the biggest source of revenue is voice telephony. So universally, operators have resisted having any kind of voice over IP over 3G data. If you look at the Apple iPhone, certainly in the U.S. and in every other country with one exception, basically Skype is blocked and whatever. The one exception is Hutchison 3 in the UK, and they actually advertise Skype, but they require you to download a special version of Skype for the Hutchison 3 iPhone, and that special version allows you to do Skype to Skype over 3G data, but you can't do Skype out. You can't call a PSTN telephone number. That you have to use your mobile voice plan. So, will it change? Obviously it will, but I would say that the voice over IP over 3G is going to be a battleground for at least the next 5 years, because that, until and unless the mobile operators find other revenue sources, mobile voice is still the number one thing, and you're not going to be in business. You're not going to be putting in new, core network upgrades and new radio gear to up the speeds if you don't have revenue, and the revenue comes from voice first and SMS second. So yes.
Care to comment on what Google Voice does to carrier networking and disrupting that role? Do you think carriers will ever say, we need to get involved in the application layer more now because of Google Voice, or is it going to be business as usual, or does it not matter at all?
I see Google Voice as very much in the same position as Skype, that when you look at mobile operators, they'll go increasingly to open mobile internet access. But I mentioned the reasons why. We've got this. We've got a bottleneck right now compared to the fixed internet that Moore's Law just hasn't. There's a difference between what you can do in the fixed internet and what you can do over wireless for a given amount of capital investment. So wireless is advancing at a great pace, but of course what you can do over fixed is advancing at a great pace also. So until the operators have come up with a way to deal with the issue that internet applications are winning and are clearly the end game, how do we make money enough to buy new radio gear to upgrade our core network and so forth? Until they figure that out, they're going to be fighting tooth and nail, and the piece that they're going to fight the hardest against is voice, and the second piece is SMS. Yeah.
Anyone else? I do have one other question.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about 3G and 3GS? Can you talk about the challenges that any in a new radio technology like WiMAX presents for application developers?
I don't think it presents much of an issue for application developers. I mean, we're talking connectivity, we're talking using web browsers and accessing the level down in the phone, which is the application environment that might, whether it's Java or Qt or Adobe Air. The point is that you don't care what's running below that. In the end, I mean, there are a set of people using a bunch of different technologies. We can look at, it's pretty clear that if you go out 10 years, LTE will have won. WiMAX will not go away, but it will probably be 15% of the market. The reason it won't win is that it doesn't have the volume of chip level, the prices that can be achieved for WiMAX mobile devices will never match the low cost and the high volumes of the GSM community. So the GSM community can be late, they can be slow, they can be whatever, but they currently are 88% of all the phones in the world. So as they move to HSPA, HSPA Plus, and eventually to LTE, it may be 2015, it may be 2020, but they're going to win because of critical mass. WiMAX isn't going to go away, but they, if they're lucky, they'll get 15% market share. The reason they won't go away is while in the U.S. you can run whatever you want on any frequency, in most of the countries in the world, licenses are given out for specific technologies and specific bands, and there have been a great number of licenses issued in different countries for WiMAX on specific hunks of spectrum. And regulatory things tend to be tied up for decades, not for years. Therefore, WiMAX will be a viable thing, and it will happen. But it will probably be 15% market share. But I don't think it has anything to do with applications.
Any other questions? Let's have another round of applause for Brough.
No?